Well, welcome everybody to this Catholic-Buddhist dialogue on solidarity and engagement on climate change. I'm Joshua Bassifin, Director of Climate Action for the Parliament of the World's Religions. And I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, Earth Day Network, Catholic Climate Covenant, CADEO, the Catholic Association of Diocesan Ecumenical and Interreligious Officers, and the Society for Buddhist Christian Studies. And greetings from all of us on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day. We're very proud that every parliament of the world's religions convening since the first one in 1893 has included representatives of the Buddhist and Catholic traditions. And in the climate assemblies at our last convenings in both Salt Lake City in 2015 and Toronto in 2018, Catholics and Buddhists were integral to the conversation on climate, conveying their unique moral imperatives to address climate change. Buddhism and Catholicism share some very potent insights into the world. The idea that our lives can have meaning beyond ourselves, that we can be redeemed through our service to others. The idea that we should care for the downtrodden, the forgotten, that we should be compassionate. The idea that we are interconnected and interwoven with each other and with the natural world, that we cannot be separated from them. The idea that there is something far more fulfilling in this world than what material things can give us, and that consumerism will not fulfill us or give us a sense of belonging. And the idea that we can and should alleviate suffering in the world in all its forms. These two traditions, practiced by a combined nearly 2 billion people in the world, have a great deal to teach us about how to be better stewards of our planet. And this 50th anniversary of Earth Day provides an opportunity for exploring their connection and their fraternity with one another. Audrey Kitagawa, the chair of our board of trustees here at Parliament of the World's Religions, has been collecting Earth Day greetings from spiritual leaders all over the world over the last several months. And to set the tone for our conversation today, we want to share two of those greetings with you. One is from Father Joshua Koritadam, who is the coordinator of the Sector of Ecology and Creation at the Vatican Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. And the other is from Venerable Guo Chan of Dharma Drum Mountain. And Mimi, if you could play those videos now.
Hi everyone. The World Earth Day is a meaningful and important day for all of us on this planet. We are all one Earth community. We rely on each other to survive and also to fulfill our dreams. So on this very special day, I will pray for everyone be safe, be healthy, be happy, be awakened, and be at ease. To look after our hearts, always listen to our heart is very important. Just like how we take care of the global common. But the foundation has to be from this person. It's physically healthy and also spiritually reached. So that is all work together, then we will have a better future for our generations to come. Thank you.
Peace of God be with you all. It's a moving experience for me to be standing here on the banks of the Dead Sea, the same land of Jesus. And I'm moved by the realization that God, who created everything, chose to be born on this earth. That earth is central to God's plans. And I'm reminded of two of the teachings of Jesus. Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. And this is the first prayer I would like to make, that we may become more gentle, that we may become more compassionate, that we may become more loving towards Mother Earth. And the second teaching of Jesus in the Beatitudes is that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. And I would like to pray with Saint Francis of Assisi, who said, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Let all of us become instruments of God's peace for humanity and especially for Mother Earth, because if we come together, we can once again rebuild our common home. And the third prayer I would like to make is that we may all draw energy from God, the energy from above, rooted on the earth, standing in solidarity with our brothers and sisters, especially the poorest among us. Let us turn to God above, and God will send God's Holy Spirit, the Ruah, the Spirit of God over the entire creation. And the Psalm 103 says, Lord, send forth your Spirit and renew the face of the earth. Let's ask God to renew once again God's earth, once again our fraternity, once again our Mother Earth. Thank you very much.
Thanks and gratitude to Venerable Guochan and Father Corey Tatum for those insights and that wisdom. Now, I'd like to introduce our distinguished group of panelists for the conversation that we'll be having for the remainder of the session today. Dakila Chungyalpa is a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner and works closely with His Holiness the Karmapa, the head of the Karma-Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, on environmental protection efforts in the Himalayas. Dakila is the director of the Loka Initiative, an innovative education and outreach program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for faith leaders and religious institutions. She also founded and directed Sacred Earth, an acclaimed faith-based conservation program at the World Wildlife Fund from 2009 to 2014. Kathleen Deignan is a sister of the Congregation of Notre Dame. She is professor of religious and environmental studies at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York, and also founding director of the Kathleen Deignan Institute for Earth and Spirit at Iona College. Leo Lefebure is the Matteo Ricci Professor of Theology at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and a Berkeley Center faculty fellow. He's also a research fellow of the Chinese University of Hong Kong and a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago. And David Loy is a professor, writer, and Zen teacher in the Sanbo Zen tradition of Japanese Buddhism. His essays and books have been translated into many languages, and his articles appear regularly in Buddhist magazines, including Tricycle, Lion's Roar, and Buddha Dharma. His latest book, published last year, is Eco-Dharma, Buddhism, Buddhist Teachings for the Ecological Crisis. So we'll be segmenting the discussion today into two parts, and each part will have both presentations and discussion. In the first part, we'll be setting the context. Both Buddhism and Catholicism recognize that we live in a world of suffering, in part as a result of the impacts of a changing climate and its intersectional impacts on both nature and people. Both traditions teach compassion towards one another, particularly the poorest among us. The second session, we'll be talking about how to live out our values and discussing the kinds of activism that we need to see in the Catholic and Buddhist communities on climate change and what more is needed. In this first part, Leo will present the Catholic theology of creation in relation to care for the earth and care for our neighbors, and David will present on how Buddhism looks at the relationship with the earth and humanity. So now I'd like to turn it over to Leo.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to be with Buddhist and Catholic colleagues for this very important conversation. Psalm 19 tells us, "The heavens are telling the glory of God. Day to day pours forth speech, night to night imparts knowledge. Their voice goes out through all the earth." So all creation, in a sense, has a voice and gives praise to God. So all the different creatures are part of this chorus. St. Francis of Assisi picked up on this image when he composed his own prayer poem known as Laudato Si, same title that Pope Francis will use. And he praises God in and through all the different creatures, including creatures we often think of as not living. Brother sun, sister moon, water, air, and fire, all of these give praise to God. So all creation, in a sense, is not a collection of objects to be exploited, but rather a communion of subjects who praise God together. And Francis of Assisi, in his own life, united care for the poor, care for those suffering. He especially reached out to lepers, which he found very, very difficult, but expressed compassion to them. Care for other creatures. He preached to the birds, according to one account, and then in one legend, healed a wolf in Gubbio. So he has this broader sense of community. So it's no accident that Pope Francis looked to Francis of Assisi as the inspiration for his encyclical on care for the earth, Laudato Si. Begins by quoting Francis of Assisi and then stresses the three concerns: care for the earth, care for the poor and vulnerable, and friendship with all people of goodwill, including Buddhists. And he specifically notes this is a global problem to care for the earth, which needs a global solution. And so he stresses the interrelationship between interreligious dialogue and care for the earth and the poor. One of the basic teachings of Pope Francis in this encyclical resonates with the teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha: everything is interconnected. So there's many differences between Buddhists and Catholics in some regards, but in other areas we converge very strongly in this awareness of interdependence and interrelationship. So when Pope Francis calls for an integral ecology, this means seeing the interrelationships among all the different aspects of our life and of our relationship to the earth. Last month, the Vatican Office for Integral Development issued a very powerful statement: Aqua fons vitae, water, the fount of life. And it's looking at water in relation to all these concerns, noting that waters speak the language of boundlessness. Waters can unite. 1/4 of humanity lives along coasts, but water is threatened. And Pope Francis proclaims access to clean water is a basic human right. And he warns us not to instrumentalize water. Again, even though we don't think of it as living in our usual way of thinking, water gives praise to God. Water has an intrinsic value which is not for us to violate. The wells in the Bible were places of meeting. And so the Vatican document uses this as a reminder that water can be a source of coming together. Precisely today, we're aware of the dangers, the way we attack the bodies of water on this planet and the way we pollute them, which really threatens our life together. And so I'm very delighted to be part of this conversation. I'd also like to just note briefly, Father Josh posted reflections on the current coronavirus crisis in relation to ecological concerns. It's available on the Vatican website for his unit, which I heartily recommend to you. So I'll wrap up there for now.
David, you are still muted. Here, let me unmute you.
All right.
There we go.
Thank you, Joshua. It's rather difficult to generalize about Buddhism as a whole because, like Christianity, it's not a single unified tradition, but rather as Buddhism spread throughout Asia, it interacted with local cultures and the teaching sort of evolved. So all I can do here in the time that's available is present what I believe to be the most insightful understanding about the relationship between humanity and the earth, with apologies to any other Buddhists who may see that relationship differently. In any case, at the core of Buddhism is the concept of dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but we have to understand that in the broadest possible sense to include dissatisfaction, anxiety, dis-ease. There are different types, different sources of dukkha, but perhaps the most problematical is dukkha due to the delusion of a self that feels separate from others and from the earth. So here, there's a connection with that other really important Buddhist concept about no self, the denial that there's some me, maybe behind the eyes, inside the body somewhere, that's separate from you and the rest of the world outside, denying that duality. Accompanying that, of course, is usually another delusion that my own well-being is separate from theirs, from yours, which is where lots of problems begin, of course. The Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh said, "We are here to overcome the illusion of our separateness." And that overcoming, that realization, is what Buddhists call enlightenment or awakening. So the Buddhist path isn't about realizing or gaining anything new, but simply realizing the way things have always been, realizing my true nature and the true nature of the world. So for Buddhism, we can say the fundamental issue really isn't morality, good versus evil, but it's this issue of delusion versus awakening. The Indian Zen, Indian master Nisargadatta put it very well when he said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life turns." Wisdom and love, or as Buddhists say, wisdom and compassion, the two pillars of the Buddhist path. Another way to say it, and this is again, obviously, as we've just heard, an important intersection with Christianity, with Catholicism, is that Buddhism emphasizes our interdependence. That none of us, in fact, nothing has any separate reality or being of its own, because everything is dependent on many other things. Now, usually that teaching, we tend to focus on our relationship with other people, but it obviously applies just as much, if not more, to our interdependence on the earth or with the earth, which is not just our home, but our mother. And in fact, in this case, we never really cut the umbilical cord. If you're not sure about that, try to stop breathing for 4 minutes and see what happens. As Zen Master Dogen exclaimed after his own awakening, "I came to realize that my mind is nothing other than rivers and mountains and the great wide earth, the sun and the moon and the stars." Right? So what does this mean for the ecological crisis? That from a Buddhist perspective, it's most fundamentally rooted in our collective sense of separation from the earth. We can understand how that evolved historically and technologically, but we can see how our basic attitude today is that we're still mostly relating to earth as nothing more than a source of raw materials for us to use and as a sink for the waste that we want to dump into it. In other words, the earth has become just a means to our ends, having no other value or meaning, of no importance in and of itself, apart from its value for us. So we don't have any sense of responsibility to it and its other species. And here another Buddhist teaching about karma kicks in. Because we're not really separate from the earth, if we make it sick, as we're doing now, then we're going to become sick too. Thich Nhat Hanh said, "If we continue abusing the earth this way, there's no doubt that our civilization will be destroyed. The Buddha attained individual awakening. Now we need a collective awakening to stop this course of destruction." But, we can ask, we can wonder, what would a collective awakening involve? Does it mean that we all have to start meditating, in which case we might have to wait for rather a long time? But I think more fundamentally, what it implies is challenging our individual preoccupation with consumption. And to be frankly, consumerism often seems to me the real religion of our time, right? If religion teaches us what's important about the world and how to live in it, you could say consumerism is the most successful religion of all time. But from a Buddhist perspective, I think we have to challenge both our individual preoccupation with consumption and our collective preoccupation with never-ending economic growth, which is a larger version of the same thing, right? We need to ask ourselves, why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? For Buddhism, we need to realize and appreciate that our species is, like all other species, one manifestation of the inherent creativity of the earth, and that we are in profound interdependence with its other species, its other biological and physical processes, which means, of course, replacing our insatiable craving, both our personal and our collective insatiable craving for more and more, with a gratitude that naturally wants to cherish, appreciate, and take care of our Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leo and David. I think you've really set the tone for this conversation really fantastically. Very, very good insights. I have some questions for our discussion, but before I do that, I want to say to our audience members, you have a question and answer section on your panel, and we'll be taking questions from you throughout the conversation, and then towards the end, we'll be looking at some of those and answering them in the last maybe 20 or 30 minutes of the session. So feel free to scroll down to that Q&A bar and, or that, I think it's a chat bar, and, or sorry, if there are questions, there's a question bar, and ask some questions there. I think it's interesting that both Leo and David picked up on this idea of interconnectedness. So Leo talked about the intrinsic value of water and access to water as a basic human right, and the interconnectedness of us to not only nature but to other people, and really the intersectionality of the ecological crisis that we're facing right now as both a manifestation of suffering in natural systems and suffering in human systems. And David also talked about overcoming the illusion of separation. You know, that we have this illusion that we have been separated from each other, that we have been separated from nature. And I think there's a real synergy there between those two ideas. And I want to ask, what does that imply? And more broadly, what does the climate crisis imply about how we understand and practice our respective traditions? So Catholicism and Buddhism are both steeped in long traditions, and we've, in a lot of ways, been practicing them in the same way for a long time. But do we need to think about how we practice our traditions going forward? And yeah, go ahead, Leo.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Pope Francis would share a lot of the concerns that David was expressing over consumerism, that he also targets this as one of the great kind of fictions of the modern world, that the world is a limitless source of items that we can exploit so that we're always consuming more and more. And he attacked the notion of a throwaway culture where we rapidly consume and throw away things. And that's very good for certain people in the economy, but the poor are devastated and the effects on the earth itself are horrific. And so Pope Francis calls us to aesthetics as one way to get out of this. Up and see and listen to the beauty of the world, to get us out of this consumer mindset. We're always objectifying and always looking at what we can use things for, and then allow things, in a sense, to speak of an aesthetic good and call us to what he calls an ecological conversion. So at the basis of this is really a challenge, a technocratic paradigm that measures everything in terms of profit and market efficiency, and then to an ecological awareness of interdependence, where a lot of our values really resonate very strongly. Like when David Lloyd has written about the 3 poisons that Buddhists name as the source of our trouble, as a Catholic, I resonate completely with that we're ignorant. I don't know who I really am. I grasp at things to make me happy and secure. That doesn't work out really well. So then I get angry. And so that reinforces my ignorance. So I'm constantly going around among ignorance, craving, anger without ever getting out. And I can spend a huge amount of money in this rat race, but I never get out of it. And that's where I think the ecological conversion that Pope Francis is talking about resonates very deeply with what our Buddhist friends tell us about getting out of dukkha.
If I can build on what Leo said and clarify a little bit, he referred to the three poisons. So, you know, Buddhism doesn't really talk about good and evil, as I said, at least that's not the usual vocabulary, but the Buddha does talk about these three poisons, which are sometimes called the three roots of evil, greed, ill will, delusion. Traditionally, they've been understood on an individual level, that is to say, my own personal problem. But I think one of the interesting developments happening now is that we're starting to realize that they can become institutionalized, that is to say, take on a life of their own. So for example, I think greed, I think to a large extent, it's been institutionalized in our economic system. You know, if greed is you never have enough, I think that applies not only to our own consumerism, but our stock market and the way corporations have to keep growing. The GDP is never large enough and so forth. I think we've institutionalized ill will in our militarism and attitude toward refugees. I think we've institutionalized delusion in terms of not only fake news, but more fundamentally, the fact that the media are mostly corporate, private, and they're mainly interested in making money from advertising. So we can see how they work, not only these three poisons on an individual level, but on a collective level as well. And this is an interesting new development in Buddhism, sort of, if the dukkha isn't just individual due to our individual actions, if it's also institutionalized, how do we address that? And that's the second point, that within the Buddhist tradition, stronger in Mahayana than in earlier Buddhism, is this idea of the bodhisattva path. That is to say that we should want to transform ourselves and awaken not just for our own benefit, especially if we see through the illusion of separation, but for the well-being of everyone. So that somebody who is following the Buddhist path, that one of the ways that they overcome our sort of self-preoccupation is we become concerned about whether, you know, what's happening with other people. And again, given the ecological crisis now, I think what's happening is we're not only talking about this bodhisattva path, but the ecosattva path, in the sense of it's not just about helping other people, but it's looking at the earth. How do we help? How do we work together to heal the earth? So this is now becoming, I think, a very important part of the Buddhist path in the modern world.
Thank you, David. I want to invite Dr. Deignan and Dakila into this conversation, and particularly for you, Dakila, you know, you come from the Himalayas, and there has been a tremendous change in natural systems in the Himalayas. I've heard the Himalaya region referred to as the third pole, because of just the rapid nature of the change that we've been seeing there. So I wonder if you could discuss what that means, you know, from a Buddhist perspective and in terms of, you know, Tibetan Buddhists living in that region.
Hi.
There you go.
So what I was going to say, picking up on what Leo and David said first, is that, you know, I see so much commonality between the two religions. Putting aside, you know, our love for the robes and our love for all the splendor that are in churches and monasteries, there's also a lot of commonality in how we see at the core of what climate change is actually exposing, right? Sometimes I find myself looking at climate change, and recently COVID-19 too, from this lens of how wise the creator is, or how wise the earth system is in itself, because it's exposing everything that was wrong with the consumer society that David described, right? It's exposing exactly the inadequacies of these systems that we've set up based on greed, based on attachment, you know, based on delusions and so on. I think the impact, especially in the Himalayas, of course, where a lot of the communities are very remote, they don't have access to science, they don't have access to hospitals, is that there is a tendency for these communities to think you know, it is either God or one of the gods that is angry with them, right? There is actually, interestingly, through the ecological crisis, there's been this really painful separation and doubt that's been created. And so this is actually how I ended up in many ways working with religions and working on climate change, was that when I was working in Nepal, this is in the early 2000s, the Sherpa community that are the mountain climbers ended up saying in one of the meetings that we have, is Chomolungma angry? Is that why her face has changed? And Chomolungma, of course, is the mountain Everest. And the way they saw it, it was that the earth actually had completely changed its face to them, the children. And it was such a painful comment that they made that I think it made me realize that we had to, from the science world, really reach out and explain what was happening in a way that brought the sacred back into the science, that united us from God or us from our faith, right? That was the first piece, that we owed that to people everywhere who are suffering from the impacts of climate change. I think the other part too was realizing that communities themselves not only needed the science, they needed the solutions, and they needed to be the holder of the solutions. I mean, going back to what David brought up as systems, part of the problem that we have with neoliberalism is that it has infected every other aspect of life. You know, you look at conservation models, environmental models, climate change models, most of these movements are extremely neoliberal in their design. They are very hierarchical. They come from the west to the east or from the north to the south, however we want to describe it. They are still very institutionally driven by Western science. And there is very little space, for example, for indigenous leadership or indigenous cosmologies, right? Which is probably the most ecologically friendly philosophy that exists anywhere on the planet. And so I think going back to this idea of what we have in common is this desire to change the systems on several levels, not just philosophically, not just in terms of giving speeches, but also in terms of who we are at the core as people of faith.
Beautiful. Kathleen, I see that you want to say something, but you're muted. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you, Dakila. Thank you for such an expansive context for this conversation. I would like to just say that, to add to this, that if there is a blessing in our planetary crisis for these traditions and for religious traditions globally, inclusively, I think it's that we have finally arrived at an awareness of endgame. And I think that what in the Catholic community we might call this eschatological horizon, even an apocalyptic horizon, in the sense that we are really talking about devastation to the life systems of our living planet. These have activated the urgency for religious traditions to come into their ecological phase. And I think that we have seen this throughout the religions of the world. We've seen each and every religious tradition labor to awaken what we might call the ecological charism or gift or consciousness at the heart of their traditions, and to somehow make this foundation, make this platform the basis of moving forward for faith traditions on the planet as communities of healing, as communities of wisdom and vision, as communities that really need to be the cultivators of a new planetary civilization. And to do this in vigorous ways, I think that this planetary crisis that we're facing has emboldened our faith traditions to speak and to act in new ways to not only address the crisis that we are experiencing, but to assume our rightful place as wisdom leaders, as guides, as communities of insight and vision and transformation that will aid each of us personally, but our communities in their corporate nature to be the systems, so to speak, that will bring this transformation or conversion into realization.
Thank you, Kathleen, for that contribution. I want to pick up on something that both Kathleen and Dakila said. So, Dakila, you said something really, I think, incredible, really resounding, which is that the idea of bringing the sacred back into the science. And then, Kathleen, you talked about how the crisis has emboldened our traditions to act in different ways. So I want to think about acting in different ways and think about about science, which is really important right now. And there is a kind of a hard truth that in some of our communities, there is not a recognition that climate change is a crisis. We see that in the US and in the climate community. I think in Asia, you can see that a little bit in some countries in the Buddhist communities. And I wonder if we could, maybe in the last few minutes of this part of our discussion, if we could talk about what our two traditions say about science, like what can we communicate through our traditions about the importance of kind of rectifying that schism between religion and science. And I put that out to all of you.
If I may just say that I do see within my own students, I'm a professor of religious and environmental studies, that there is the young generation, the present, the future generation does not, in my experience, suffer that schism as much as perhaps elder generations. And I think that there is a wholesome and easy integration or how shall we say, deep capacity to see science as its own school of wisdom, informing and explicating for us the mystery, so to speak, that our religions either celebrate or honor, reverence, and labor to protect.
You know, following on that, the Dalai Lama has famously said that, you know, if there's a conflict between some Buddhist teaching and science, that we should go ahead and accept the conclusions of, you know, strong scientific evidence and change some of the teachings of Buddhism. And I think this is a very important point, that ultimately we shouldn't see it as an irreconcilable struggle between the two, but rather what's needed now is really a conversation, I think, between the best of the science and the best of religion. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more later on. For example, Thomas Berry, I think within the Catholic tradition, has been a really important voice in say understanding the evolutionary process in a different way. So I don't see the conflict as necessarily that difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree very strongly. And Thomas Berry is a wonderful example of someone trying to bring together reflection on religion and reflection on science. I think the current crisis actually is setting up, at least for some actors, a new type of alliance between science and religion. I was in Rome with Buddhists for a Buddhist Catholic dialogue right at the time that Laudato Si was issued. And right before I was at dinner, in Rome with an American journalist, and he was asking me about these things. And I said, I think a lot of scientists are hoping that Pope Francis can get a level of attention for their scientific findings on climate change and the lack of biodiversity on a level that they haven't been able to engage the public sector. Now, there was a woman across the way without a dinner partner, and she couldn't help overhearing me, and she was a professional scientist, not a believer, but she interrupted our conversation and completely agreed. And so I think that there's a history, in particular in the Catholic Church, of earlier conflicts where some religious actors intervened in improper ways in scientific discussions. Catholic Church has apologized for that at this point and fully supports the exploration of the natural world through science. What Pope Francis worries about is more the technocratic paradigm where science only serves profit. And then it becomes a means of domination, and some people, many people will suffer, and many species get wiped out. And so in that sense, science is this type of apocalyptic threat that Kathleen was talking about. But if we go through this ecological conversion, again, the values of the Buddhist tradition and of the Catholic tradition converge, I think, in giving a direction for scientific exploration in service of humanity and the whole community of life on this planet.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add is, so as Joshua referred to, I've been working with different religious leaders now for about 12 years on environmental and climate issues. And what's really interesting to me is how we as humanity have a tendency to put the burden on our leaders, no matter who they are, no matter what institution we're talking about. And in this case, you know, there's a tendency to conflate the religion with the religious leader. What I've learned is that, you know, and I often use the example of the Catholic Church because all three of the last popes, including Pope Francis, actually have spoken really clearly about climate change and the fact that they completely believed in the climate science. You know, Pope John Paul did it, Pope Benedict did it. In fact, during Pope Benedict's time, I think the Vatican declared itself as the first carbon neutral nation state, right? They were very proud of it. And so I find that I use the examples of religious leaders all the time to explain to the congregation and the clergies in both religions that actually your leaders are very pro-science when it comes to environmental and climate issues. The question is, what is the obstacle that blocks us at the mid? Let's say if we think of it as a hierarchy at the middle level, and what is it that prevents people from absorbing this information and changing this life at an individual or at a congregation level? And often what we find are the very things that both Leo and David talked about, you know, that we are very attached to our way of life. In the United States, there is no question about the fact that there is enormous amounts of money that have gone into building a climate denial movement, right? And that money was used to target climate scientists, to sow doubt, to create this what I would call a false narrative that is based on religion, that if you believe in these religious values, you must reject climate science. And I don't want to get, I know that's not the purpose of this talk, so I don't want to get into it. But I think what religious leaders can do is to constantly talk about that and bring it up front to say that science is in no way, science doesn't attempt to question whether God exists. Science doesn't attempt to question whether, you know, Buddhist philosophy is valid, right, as a way of thought. Science is as much of a search for truth as religion is. And I think there has to be a way that we in the science world, first of all, promote that, because I do think that scientists as a whole are terrible about talking about the limitations of science. And this is where we are doing our own, you know, our own issues that we care about the most, quite a bit of wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's going to be about the end of our time for this section of our program for today. So we're going to move into the next section now. And here we're going to focus on what we're calling living out our values, talking about the kinds of activism that we've seen in the Catholic and Buddhist communities on climate change and what more is needed. And, you know, I want to say as a kind of preliminary statement here that there has been some great activism in both communities. I think about the divestment movement in the Catholic community, and there's just a tremendous amount of momentum that's starting to pick up on divestment. In fact, if you look at the something like 12 or 13 trillion dollars of divestment that's happened in the world, a lot of it has been Catholic institutions, which is really phenomenal. And in the Buddhist community, what I've seen is a lot of momentum towards protecting nature and natural restoration as a means to both kind of buttress natural systems and also defense against climate change. So I think there has been some really good progress, but not enough, absolutely not enough. And considering, you know, as I said, there are 2 billion almost 2 billion people in the world that practice these traditions. We've got to see more, and that's what we're going to focus on here. So I'm going to first go to Dakila to present on kind of what we've seen in the Buddhist community on activism, and then directly after that, we'll go to Dr. Deignan.
So I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about the history of Buddhism and ecology, starting with Lord Buddha, right? Buddha's example is just so environmental. He was born under a tree. He gained enlightenment under a tree. Once he gained enlightenment, he chose the first group of living beings that he chose to teach to was actually a group of deer, was a deer family. He, of course, passed away under a tree. And so for a very long time, when I was looking for examples of great environmental teachings, what I kept coming back to was the example of how Buddha lived, how all of these great teachers throughout the ages have lived and extorted, right? We have Shantideva, who is famous for writing the Bodhisattva's way of life, Ajahn Chah from the Theravada tradition in Thailand, Patul Rinpoche, who wrote Words of My Perfect Teacher. These are all teachers who basically said to us, live simply, live with compassion for all sentient beings. And that was the essence of the ecological, I would say, knowledge that they imparted to us. Then in more recent times, there have actually been attempts to live in more environmental harmony, especially among monastic traditions. Of course, you have forest monks in Thailand. You know, in Tibetan Buddhism, there is this very ritualistic giving up of meat, living very simply, giving away your belongings during certain festivals and prayer, what would I call them? Like, especially when you're on pilgrimage, for example. The first time I heard of a Buddhist teacher doing something very specific about the environment was when His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the 90s sent a message to Tibetans in Tibet to say, stop wearing the fur of endangered species. Immediately, all the Tibetans stopped and started burning the fur. And it led to a whole political, very anxious period in Tibet, where then, of course, because of Tibet's, the political situation of Tibet being part of China and so on, it just created a political movement. However, at that time, I remember observing that and thinking, this is the first time I've heard a religious leader in my tradition, not by example, not by religious teaching, but actually to stop and give what I would call an exhortation in activism language, which is stop doing something in your material life, right? Change your behavior. I often joke that when I began working with Tibetan Buddhist leaders, it really was a very short-term commitment on my part. I was asked by His Holiness the Karmapa, who, as Joshua said, is the head of one of the lineages of Tibetan Buddhism, to create a set of environmental guidelines in 2008. And he had this very clear vision, which was that he wanted the monasteries and nunneries across the Himalayas and in Tibet that were within part of his lineage to get off the meditation mat and go out into the community. He was very clear that he felt the monastics were really disengaged with community, and that just sitting in a room or sitting on a prayer mat and meditating on compassion wasn't sufficient. And that was the first time I realized this is a new path. This is engaged Buddhism. This is engaged religion, where the hierarchy itself is involved in lessening their footprint. And the hierarchy is involved in taking control of developing their own environmental solutions and implementing them. So from that set of guidelines emerged this movement that's now called Koryug, which has over 50 monasteries and nunneries across the Himalayas doing environmental work. They do, they all have solar, they're all vegetarian, they do plantation of species, of indigenous tree species, and so on. And in the last 4 or 5 years, they've been working very much on disaster preparedness around climate change, but also other issues. I think the hope that I see is that while previous forms of religious, environmental action were focused on statements, right, and dialogue and speeches, we're now in a new era where social and environmental issues are seen as being intersectional, where religions are no longer ignoring social injustices and ecological injustices, that there is this recognition that social and environmental injustice is the same thing. So I think it's really important that we in the religious worlds, we from our different religions really examine where do we go from here. Catherine brought up the fact that younger generation is at a very different place than where we were. They have a vocabulary that is so much richer, so much more integrated. For them, the concept of integral ecology or interdependence is actually, instinctively understood, right? Whereas during my time, the word intersectional didn't even exist. So I feel like we're at the point now where we decide how we integrate ecological and climate action into our, and that is where, I think that is where we go next.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dakila. Thank you. I would like to offer the perspective, if I can, or at least my limited perspective as Catholic within the Catholic community, witnessing over decades and decades this awakening consciousness of the ecological commitments inherent within our tradition. Now, of course, as I think both of our Buddhist companions have suggested, I mean, there's a connaturality within Buddhism to an understanding of the unitive nature of all existence, of all reality. In the Catholic Christian tradition, we have, of course, been entrusted for everyone with the intuition that we call incarnation. That is to say that divinity is embodying itself more and more within the unfolding universe of its creation. And so in this particular moment, I think we are laboring in the Catholic community to become not just a church of the in the battlefield of the planet, as Francis wants to say, but we're laboring to become a church of that's being celebrated in the wisdom of Laudato Si. Francis speaks about educating the community for the covenant between humanity and the living world. And I think that we have seen throughout the Catholic world tremendous cultural, spiritual, educational initiatives happening. For better or worse, Catholicism is a largely institutionalized phenomenon. And at this stage, we really need to appropriate that institutional development and reality to promote the kind of urgent action that we are seeing need for. We are at a crossroad, as Thomas Merton would say. We are just about sailing across the rim of chaos at this stage. and we need to try to comprehend how we shall recover a certain kind of balance within the natural world. Because to change everything is going to require everyone, we realize that action is going to be required of everyone, not just on the part of papal administrators, Vatican administrators, who have done quite a wonderful job, as Dakila has remarked, for several administrations. But we need to see how the Catholic community itself is going to integrate the wisdom and the urgent manifesto that has come to us in what I think is a Laudato movement. And as that Laudato movement gains traction and suasion, I think we begin to see every feature of Catholic life and culture articulating its own way to realize that wisdom. We see it in catechesis, in liturgy and preaching, teaching, and spiritual practice, in the proliferation of Catholic networks and programs, communities of prayer and action of all sorts. We know that Pope Francis, inspired by his brother, Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, has instituted a month-long season of creation in October, beginning with the Feast of Francis, that's meant to seriously impress the importance and urgency for an integral option for the care of our common home. And I think we see throughout the Catholic world, our institutions of all kinds are amending their mission statements and their practices to articulate their environmental commitments. We see letters from Catholic university presidents internationally pledge that their universities are going to make central these environmental commitments in all of the facets of academic life, in environmental studies courses. We see a proliferation in the development of ecological theology. We see retreats and spirituality programs articulating a variety of ecological spiritualities all over the Catholic world. I think we see in particular religious orders research and celebrate their own ecological charisms and revising their mission statements and orientations so that they can be leaders in this way. So I think Catholics have always leaned into action, and that's good news, maybe. But I think the greater challenge for Catholic people is a kind of more courageous work of grounding ecological action in contemplative depth and practice, which I think is why we're so almost universally attracted to our Buddhist brothers and sisters, in whom we see this resolute depth, consistently practiced, great effort invested in awakening, in, as David was suggesting, the transformation of those poisons. So I'd like to begin to, I'd like to just offer, since we've summoned Thomas Berry into our midst, I'd like to conclude my offerings in this regard for the moment by speaking about how the human person, how we can take this vision that, as Dakila has been saying, is so well articulated in Catholic doctrine and Catholic teaching, and make this wisdom live within the human person. This is an evolutionary mandate. It is an evolutionary urgency that we do this. Father Thomas, once upon a time, offered 3 guidance questions, actually, to bring us forward into what he would call the ecozoic. And I'd like to share with you those 3 questions and then offer a 4th. The questions for me function like koans. They are provocations to my habitual mind, to my old self, to risk a certain kind of, as we say in the Catholic community, death, so that something new may arise, someone new may arise. As Father Thomas says, the great challenge of our time is the reinvention of the human. We've all spoken of this in our traditions. In the Catholic Christian world, we speak about it as rebirth. In the Buddhist tradition, we speak about it as this awakening of a new mind. In the Catholic community, we have also utilized a particular practice called examen, or the examination of consciousness. It's an ancient practice that invites us to try to be really mindful of our every thought, word, and deed. So here are Thomas's 3+1 koans that I think might be helpful. He asks us to carry this with us. Is my next thought, word, or deed sustainable for me and my planetary kin? That is to say, is it life-giving? Is it viable? Or rather, is it violating for myself and for the whole Earth community? Will this next thought, word, or deed aid me, aid us to survive? Will it aid us to flourish and to thrive? The second question he offers is my next thought, word, or deed an expression of intimacy with and for all my relations in this shared household of life? Is it a way for me to put on the mind and the heart of Christ, to walk the way, the nonviolent path of Jesus? Is this next thought, word, or deed an expression of presence to that mystery, presencing itself to me? Does it aid me in cultivating the tenderness of the Sacred Heart? Is my next thought, word, or deed, he would ask, celebratory of the wonder of creation, the splendor of the cosmos, beheld in the smallest thing, moment by moment by moment? And does this awakening nurture gratitude and joy in my nature? These are virtues or soul powers of the new human person rising to fuller life. And so the last one I offer is my next thought, word, and deed an expression of commitment, of solidarity with those who suffer worst and first the violence of global disruption and degradation? Is my next thought, word, and deed prophetic of the world laboring to come, the beloved society that we are midwifing in every thought, word, and deed to birth? This is the work of our hearts and our hands and our mind. This solidarity of kin, of brothers and sisters in the one cosmic Christ, in the living Buddha, in the living Christ, in the one cosmic family.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was beautiful, and I think really illustrative of the connections between Catholicism and Buddhism. I was thinking while you were speaking, just the incredible, very nuanced interconnections between the two kind of modalities. I want to bring David and Leo into this conversation, and one of the things I've been thinking about is, somebody mentioned the idea of our faith leaders, our spiritual leaders in our different traditions, kind of messaging about how we need to change our societies and change our own lifestyles and behaviors. And I've heard other folks in the kind of interfaith climate movement say, how is it that they're not constantly talking about this? How is it that, you know, Buddhist monks and Buddhist nuns and, you know, the lamas and our priests and our bishops are not just talking about this all the time? Because it is literally the you know, the 5,000 pound gorilla, the greatest threat to us, and what could be more important. And it's interesting that in some ways Catholicism can be very structured. You know, particularly in Roman Catholicism, there is, you know, a natural hierarchy, and also in Buddhism, you know, in some communities in Tibetan Buddhism, there is also kind of a structure, but there is kind of decentralization in other parts of Buddhism where you don't have, you know, that structured hierarchy. And so I'm wondering, what does that mean for a lot of people? Their main point of contact in their tradition is their faith leader. That's the person that they see, you know, every Sunday, every time they go to a temple or they go to a guided meditation. That's, you know, the person that they are interacting with. And so how can we create a better channel among our leaders?
In the Catholic world, there's a lot of different movements and counter movements. So on the one hand, Pope Francis is very, very popular. He has repeatedly stressed the importance of these issues of care for the earth and care for the poor and interreligious dialogue together. There are some people who don't really appreciate his style of leadership as Pope. And so like he was frustrated recently. We had a sit-in on the Amazon last fall where people to dialogue with the indigenous peoples there about the, you know, the deforestation and the devastation of traditional ways of life. And there was both the document from the Synod itself, and then Pope Francis wrote a later apostolic exhortation reflecting on it. And in both documents, there's a strong concern for ecology. So what were the worldwide headlines after Pope Francis's document came out? Almost nothing on ecology. It was all about access to ministry. Will women be ordained as deacons? Will married be ordained as priests? And Pope Francis was very frustrated because he wanted people to think about the ecological devastation going on right now in the Amazon, but the message gets filtered in different ways. So in the Catholic world, there are huge numbers of people who take this seriously. And you can give a lot of examples. Where I am at Georgetown University, we announced we're divesting from fossil fuel industries in our portfolio. Our president worked with the of other colleges and universities in the District of Columbia, and they have a common program on sustainability. So it's partly academic study to make this more and more feasible, and also living it out. So there's all kinds of people trying to do this. In my own parish, there's people very concerned. They went to the school and they were amazed at how much our Catholic grammar school was already doing on ecology. So all that is true, but this message in Catholic language has not yet been received universally. So there are other people for whom this is not a priority, or they may just disagree with the emphasis that Pope Francis has put on it. So it's kind of a divided house within the Catholic world. I mean, one study found that the Catholic Church is the most internally diverse organization on the planet.
Well, following on that from a Buddhist perspective, as Leo said, I mean, Buddhism is much more decentralized. We don't have anything comparable to a pope. So in the United States, we not only have many different traditions represented, but even those are sort of separated into different Dharma centers, different teachers who may or may not have much contact between each other. To be quite frank, I've been pretty disappointed with Buddhism in the West, or particularly Buddhism in the United States, in that I don't think we've done a very good job until quite recently, until the last year or two, when the interest in ecological issues has become much stronger. But prior to that, I think we've been very slow and very late sort of queuing into that. Now, why is that the case? Well, looking at the example of convert Buddhists, for example, here in this country, what's the attraction to Buddhism? I mean, I think the way that people became Buddhist it was because they were excited, for the most part, discovering something like meditation, a path of personal transformation. And the idea of connecting that with larger social issues, I think, has been troublesome. It's been difficult because people have tended to see that those kinds of concerns as kind of a distraction from the main practice, the real practice of meditation. I mean, and furthermore, the other thing I notice is I think in the last generation, Buddhists here have become a lot better in what you might say pulling drowning people out of the river. That is to say, homeless, uh, um, people in prisons. We have prison dharma. We have hospices and so forth. But it's been a lot more difficult for Buddhists to ask, well, why is it that there are so many more people in the river drowning? What's going on? What social forces are actually contributing to those problems and making them grow so much? So frankly, this is fairly new territory for the Buddhist tradition to develop in this kind of sense of social and ecological responsibility. I think it's happening now. I think it's happening quite quickly. But I think given the kind of legacy we've had, which is focused much more on our own personal transformation, it's, you know, we've been seeing the kind of growing pains there.
Thank you, David. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions. So I want to go to a couple of those right now. And we have a really interesting one, very, very timely for the current moment that we're living in. Somebody asks, shelter in place has already improved air and water quality. Meanwhile, our isolation seems to have damaged the social interrelatedness we are used to. What do we need to do to avoid getting back to a damaging quote unquote normal once restrictions are lifted? That, you know, I just want to add that I think it's an incredible image for a lot of us to have seen photos of Pope Francis giving his Easter messages to an empty square. And this is a really unprecedented moment that we're living through. At the same time, we are seeing air quality at improve to levels that we haven't seen in 100 years. And so how, I guess, to kind of frame up the question, how do we get back, if we get back to a normal, how do we change our normal? How do we use this moment through the lens of our traditions to make sure that we don't just kind of keep climbing up the carbon ladder?
Mm-hmm. If I may say that I have experienced, I'm sequestered all by myself since Ash Wednesday. So because I live at the epicenter, I live in New Rochelle, which of course you remember was one of the hotspots in New York. I have to say that I find the frequency and the depth of engagement across my networks, across my community, across my friendship systems to be more profound than when we were all in the normal. I don't want to go back to normal. I think that we are being offered a severe grace to awaken an intention to do precisely what both of our traditions speak of. But particularly, Francis gives us wonderful language to cultivate this new ecological civilization, a civilization of love. We are seeing the manifestation of suffering in ways that we cannot close our eyes to right now. And the very, very power of witnessing such suffering across the planet, I think is having a deep, deep effect in the minds and hearts of our generation. It is my deepest prayer. I think we must seize the opportunity of all of this suffering to really begin to say, we will not go back to that world. We must go forward. into the construction, building together a new kind of world. This is going to take generations, as we know, but I think that the wounding, the impetus is afforded us right now.
Following up on that, I think we need to see the current crisis as kind of a harbinger of other worse crises relating to destruction of biodiversity and climate change that are on the horizon, that are not quite as acute. They are going to be even more devastating. So I see this as kind of a small scale dress rehearsal in some ways. And my hope is that we learn the lesson that, and some of it's very proximate to the way they think the coronavirus began, as we move into the habitats of other species more and more, there'll be other types of interactions that could facilitate other types of virus mutating into humans. But beyond that, it's a whole series of implications of our current behavior. It's like we're on this track towards mass destruction, but we have not yet been able to adjust up to scale in terms of changing our behavior. And so my hope would be that we can learn how radically it is possible to change. Now, there's a lot of damage being done right now, and it's worried about, people starving to death because of these economic changes. So there's a lot of things we have to take into fact as the factors. But I think above all, it's rethinking our whole patterns. And here's where the traditional virtues of compassion and wisdom that are dear to both Buddhists and Catholics really come into play, where wisdom means seeing the ways concretely in which we're connected, not only with ourselves and not only with our GDP, but with all the other forms of life on this planet. And then compassion in feeling the suffering of all those. And that's my fear, is that when we come back, it'll be mainly the powerful actors who will be most in the driver's seat and will want to go back to making more profits, with little concern for those who've been hurt in this, or those who are being hurt as we move forward. But I think it's one of those learning moments. I think everybody's been surprised at how fast the global community has changed. And it's a really rare global event. How many experiences are there on this level that are truly global?
I want to come back to an earlier point, which is that the similarity between what COVID-19 exposes, right, the social ills that we face. We know, for example, in the United States, that race is the greatest indicator for where toxic dumps are situated, where nuclear dumps are situated. And we also are learning visibly that the essential workers are actually the poorest of the poor, which also happen to be Black people and people of color, right? And that they are the least protected, the most vulnerable, and for the most part, our societies haven't bothered to create safety nets for them. They are the expendables in the system, within the system. And I also really I find myself being very cautious when I talk about how nature is reviving, because I work a lot on eco-anxiety, especially with the younger generation. And there is such an overwhelming sense of guilt that humans are the problem. And so I find myself constantly having to separate this out and say, actually, human beings as a species, we are part of nature. We are indivisible from nature. It's the system that's the problem. The greatest con that ever existed is that we were convinced that the source of environmental problems, the source of climate change, is individual behavior. And we actually know it's 100 companies that produce, I think, over 75% of all the carbon on the planet, right? That are emitting the real carbon problem that we have. And so for me, I mean, I really am grateful for my own privilege that I can be in a house. We have a garden, all of those things. But I think we also have to take this time, this wonderful opportunity, the pause that Earth has put on all our lives, to design systematically what needs to change within these systems of greed, of attachment, all of those things that David mentioned, right? We have to find a way to come together to stop the system.
That is a really powerful statement, and also a really good segue to our next question. thinking about the inequalities within the system and the imbalance of power that corporations have, not just in economics, but also in our politics. And somebody asks, to what extent do our traditions share an imperative toward advocacy for systemic change through political engagement, not partisanship, but shared action toward the common good? None of you, as far as I know, are political scientists, but you may have some insights into how your traditions interact with the political process. So why don't we see an enormous Buddhist Catholic climate lobby? Can that be something?
Well, I mean, I think historically, the Shakyamuni Buddha, the original Buddha, was a lot more progressive than the institution that developed after he died. It's the usual thing that the institution often, which develops in order to preserve the original teaching, it becomes preoccupied with its own survival. When we go back to the original teachings of Buddha, I mean, it shows he was very concerned, for example, about the status of women and caste. But, you know, after his death, in order for the still nascent Buddhist cult, as it were, to survive and thrive, it had to come to some accommodation with the state. And basically, I think what that meant was the focus historically in Buddhism has been about our own individual karma, our own individual suffering due to our actions in past lifetimes, our own individual greed, ill will, and delusion. And for the most part, it's not wanted to look at what you might call collective or institutionalized dukkha. And I think that's one reason Buddhism did so well. It wasn't a threat to the authorities. So there wasn't the kind of prophetic voice that you find, for example, in the Bible, unfortunately. However, again, I think we're in this time of incredible transformation now that Buddhism comes to the modern world and it engages with the present situation, learning from other traditions like Christianity, but also having to confront the kinds of enormous institutionalized sources of suffering. I think that Buddhism is starting to evolve in the ways that we've talking about it, and I'm hopeful that that's happening. But I still see we have an issue where, because of the way the tradition has been understood and practiced, most Buddhists still tend to think of social engagement as a distraction from the fundamental process of their own awakening and their own transformation. And I think the exciting cusp is people starting to realize that, hey, no, actually engagement in the world is just as important a part of our practice, as part of our personal transformation, as whatever it is that's going on in our cushions. So, you know, I think Buddhism is growing here and moving in that direction. Yeah.
And I'd like to suggest that that there actually are Catholic climate lobbies. There are numerous networks of engaged civil society actors, agents who move through these political circles and cultivate the kinds of real knowledge that one has to be able to influence legislation and to be able to influence elections, quite frankly. So I do think that we see that. I want to go back to something Dakila said, which is that while we may have these specialists who are not necessarily religious leaders, but they are, how shall I say, they are the faithful in the secular order within our traditions. But Dakila, I think, has a very important insight, which is how do we get to the middle ground that's somewhere between the a kind of ground level unawareness on the part of people, and then these specialists who are leaders, and they are the ones who are promulgating all of these teachings. How do we get to the communities and to persons who are living their everyday lives, but who are really the powerhouse for the transformation that we're looking for and speaking to. And I think that's where we need to see new alliances. And I know one of the questions of this webinar is, what are the fora? What are the forums in which we will engage these questions together and create these new alliances?
I think Christianity went through a development somewhat similar to what David was talking about, where Jesus challenged a lot of the social assumptions of his day in the way he reached out to people and disrupted patterns that were unhealthy. And the early church was often very countercultural as a persecuted body in the Roman Empire. Once you have Constantine and the church becomes in time more established, and that lingers into European history into the very recent past, then you have more this conservative concern of the church to protect its interests. Today, I mean, we've had Catholic social teaching since Pope Leo XIII in 1991, so there's a long history of it. And in some places, it's been implemented. In other places, it's been ignored or resisted. And this is still ongoing today. And even once you engage politics, the immediate question is, what's your number one issue? And there's no consensus in the Catholic world over what should be the most important issue. So a lot of us think that ecology really should rise to the top, but that is not a universally held perspective. So again, I think there's a lot of really good actors doing a lot of wonderful things, and a lot of people who are not yet on board. In terms of our type of discussion, and here I just want to praise the work of the Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions. The hope is that when representatives of different religious traditions come together and speak with a common voice, that is a force multiplier in relationship to the political actors, whether in this country or elsewhere.
In that spirit, I would like to give a shout out to an entity like Green Faith, which is a multi-faith community, a community that forms environmental leaders within their own faith traditions. So very, very important. Again, we need to multiply those kinds of initiatives and support them.
That is an important message. Thank you. Oh, Dakila, I think you're muted.
Yes, I was going to say the challenge that I hear the most from people of faith, from from the ground up that Kathleen described, is that I actually come to the church, or I come to the monastery, or I come to the Lama to talk about my suffering, to heal in the place where I feel safe. And what you are doing is forcing me to address these issues that are out there that I want to put down. And I think that's a really legitimate concern that people have and resistance that people have. And we, I think, who are, I would say, in this special group of people who have one foot in science and one foot in religion, really have to find a compassionate way to address. I mean, I find myself with a lot of my Catholic friends, including Father Joshua, some of the discussions we have is, well, how do we decide what space is sacred, right? Similarly, how do we decide what place in people's lives are ecological places, are problem-solving places, are social justice issue places, right? How do we, within the church and within the monastery, invite people to be part of problem solving without putting a burden on them that they feel they cannot carry? And I think that has to be part of the work that I know, Joshua, that you are starting to think about, is every step we take towards inviting people of faith to work on climate and ecological issues has to be mindful of the burdens they carry.
Beautiful, thank you. We are ticking down to the end of our session today. I want to ask one more question, and maybe it'll be a question that we take with us instead of answering here. Somebody asks, and I think this question kind of brings us around full circle in a way, because we started out talking about kind of, you know, the dukkha of greed, and thinking about ourselves and the connection of that with Catholic thinking as well. So somebody asks, how do you see religion? How do you see the way that religion can influence consumerism in a more positive way? And I was reflecting on a Earth Day greeting that we received from a young Buddhist woman who said something really powerful, I think, which is our human wants are many, but actually our human needs are few. And we should recognize our actual treasure, which is the beautiful environment. And so maybe I'll just put that question out into the universe for you all to think about. This has gone so fast. I feel like we could go on with this discussion literally for hours. And luckily, there is perhaps a way that we can go on with this discussion for hours, because we have had a tremendous response to this dialogue, with literally hundreds and hundreds of people registering and attending, and it has sparked in us an idea that perhaps we should continue with this dialogue outside of this one particular session. And so we are going to be exploring an avenue for having an ongoing Catholic-Buddhist dialogue that could perhaps even in time bring some actions that we all could take and disseminate into our communities, and kind of maybe catalyze us a little bit from discussion into action. And so I want to tell all of you attending on the call that we'll be sending out an email as a follow-up to you after this session, giving you an opportunity to feedback to us if you'd like to be part of that process going forward. So let me say thank you so much to all of our co-sponsors, an enormous thank you and so much gratitude to our panelists for this really wonderful discussion. May you all be safe and well, and I wish you a very happy Earth Day. Take care. Bye for now.
Thank you,
Joshua.
Joshua.